When it comes to children, you think about kids that are always caring and always laughing, but also some of you are going to think of the opposite. But in today's story, any of your guys' feelings towards kids is about to get blown out in the water. But before we begin, if true crime stories intrigues your interest, then I highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do. And if you do subscribe, you can expect a brand new video every week. But with all that being said, let's begin. On a cold November 3rd, 1983, a girl by the name of Suzan was born into this world. And right from the get-go, her father, Albert, and her mother, Marisa, would cherish every moment that they had with her. And it did help that her family were very well off. And they lived in Brazil in a city called Sao Paulo, which the city was known for people that were quite rich. And so they would buy a small, but for us regular people, a massive mansion. And reportedly it was around about 600,000 USD. The house itself is what you expect from a massive mansion. It had a swimming pool, multiple bedrooms, and also many office rooms. Now of course, you might be wondering where did this money come from? And a lot of it did come from Albert, as he was a very talented engineer and the director of Desert, which was a state-owned company that built all the highways in Sao Paulo. And also they built all the road systems. And since he was a director of this company, this would lead to him making a massive fortune. But his wife Marisa would also work too. She would work as a psychiatrist in the local area, and she too would make good money. But it was ultimately known that the father was the breadwinner. The two would meet in the University of Sao Paulo while they were studying for civil engineering. And well, when the two first saw each other, it's what you call love at first sight. Now after Suzan was born 4 years after her birth, the family would give birth to another child named Andreas, and he and his sister would become the bestest of friends. And of course they were siblings, so it did help. And of course again, since their parents were so wealthy, their childhood would be amazing. And some might say unfortunately, and some might say fortunately, they would rarely ever face hardships. And when it came time for school, the two would go to the best of the best schools. So of course it wouldn't take long before the two became very gifted academics. During school, Suzan would be one of them shy, quiet girls that would rarely make conversation with her classmates unless she was being spoke to. And of course when it came to participating in classes, like answering questions, you would never see her put herself forward to answer. And naturally, due to her quiet demeanor, she wouldn't really make many friends. But she would make a few, which was good enough for Suzan. But throughout school, Suzan would always be the top of her class. And just before graduating, she would learn up to 3 different languages, something that no one ever does. But once she graduated, she would head to the Pontifical Catholic University of Sao Paulo, and she would go there to study law, as she found out that that was her passion. And when she got the opportunity to study law, she took that opportunity without skipping a heartbeat. Now even though she did have a passion for law, another reason that kept Suzan quite dedicated on her studies was a simple fact that since her parents were so rich, and to be more specific, the entire net worth of the family is around about 17 million. And not only did she not have to pay for any of her schooling, she would also get a promise from her father that once she was done with school, he would give Suzan a $10 million account that was already in her name and was waiting to be collected by her, but only if she finished school. But unfortunately, as many true crime stories go, it's not as simple as that. The summer of 2002, where things would change for Suzan as she would begin to start having more problems with her parents. Suzan, who was 18 at this point, and since she was grown up, her interest into the opposite gender grew. And there was at one point where the family would attend a model aircraft fair a couple of years ago. And the reason why they attended this was basically because of Suzan's brother, Andreas. And he was growing interest into model aircrafts. And so as a surprise, his father would take him to a fair all about aircrafts. But this would be something that Suzan's father could never have expected, not from a parent's perspective anyways. While at this show, Andreas would meet a guy by the name of Daniel, who was a bit of an expert at aircrafts. And since he was an expert, him and Andreas would get along very quickly, and they would become friends due to their passions. How they met was a bit unknown, but one thing's for sure, both of them loved model aircrafts. But when it came time for the family to leave, Andreas would beg his parents to pay Daniel to teach him more about model aircrafts. And And since Andreas's parents could see that their son had a massive passion for model aircrafts, they said why not. And so over the next coming weeks, Daniel would come over to Andreas's house and teach Andreas all about aircrafts. But it was during this time visiting, he would grab the attention of a very familiar face, aka Suzanne. Side note, Daniel and Suzanne had met each other, but it's unclear where they met each other. But when the two rekindled, they would immediately fall in love with each other. The two were what you call the opposites, well, at least when it came to growing up. And of course, as you know, Suzanne had a very easy upbringing, but when it came to Daniel, it was pretty much the opposite. He would come from a very poor family that, unlike Suzanne's family, would struggle to put food on the table. Daniel and his brother would work at the local garage, and unfortunately, it wasn't because they wanted to do this, it was because they had to do it, because the family just needed more money. This would also come with the cost of their education, as when they started working, they couldn't even finish high school. But despite his hardships and his overall demeanor, it would be his rebellious attitude that would intrigue Suzanne. When the couple first got with each other, Suzanne didn't know how her parents would react to this information, so in fear she would just keep this relationship a secret. But as the months go by, Suzanne's behavior would become more suspicious for her parents, thus making them follow her one day as she left her house. And that's when they found out about the whole relationship with Daniel. So when eventually Suzanne came back home, she would be confronted by her parents, and since she was backed into a corner, she would confess everything. But to her surprise, her parents weren't too bothered at first anyways. They just told her that you should have just told us earlier, which that would have saved us from following you and making such a big hassle. But like I said before, once they found out about the type of person Daniel was, they would quickly change their mind. And the main reason why the parents would change their mind on Daniel, it wasn't because of the fact that he struggled growing up and is still struggling technically. It was the fact that he would lie to them about going into law school, and also lie about him still building model aeroplanes. And Suzanne's parents, being parents, would find out about all the lies Daniel had told them. It was unclear how they found out, but they had found out anyways. The other massive problem that they had with Daniel was the fact that since he had given up law school and his aeroplane building, he turned to smoking marijuana. And it wasn't just sometimes, it was practically every time, to the point he became dependent on it. And when he didn't smoke, he became paranoid and very hazy. And since both of Suzanne's parents were her parents, they wanted the best for Suzanne. So when they found out that Daniel wasn't going to be someone that helps her go forward in life, and also the fact that he was going to bring her down and make her like him, they told Suzanne that there was no way you can see him ever again. At first, Suzanne would listen and would not go to visit Daniel, but it would turn out that that was a lie. And the reason the parents did not find out about this was Suzanne's brother would always cover her back, and every time she left the house to go visit Daniel, he would make excuses on her behalf on where she was going. So another couple of weeks would go by and Suzanne's parents still don't know that Suzanne was still seeing Daniel. But they would one day sit Suzanne down, and her brother as well, and told them that they were going on a 1-month holiday around Europe. And they would both look at Suzanne and would tell her that this is your opportunity to show us that you're mature enough, and if you do show us that, we'll reward you. So the next couple of days would go by and Suzanne's parents left the country, but Suzanne, instead of being the responsible girl that her parents were hoping for, she would essentially just invite Daniel over and basically letting him move in with her. And of course, when he got this invitation, he was always going to accept it. And for the next month, the two would just sit around the house intoxicated with either marijuana or alcohol or other various drugs. A month would go by and Suzanne's parents would come back from the holiday, and they could instantly see that their house was a mess. There was alcohol bottles everywhere, the smell of marijuana was all over the house, and just basically the whole house was a tip. And it wouldn't really take a genius to figure out that Suzanne had brought Daniel over to the house, and this in turn would start a massive shouting match between Suzanne and her parents. But even though the first screaming match would end and both parties still upset with each other, over the next couple of weeks that would still continue, and every argument that would occur, the more desperate Suzanne would become, even to the point where she would ask her father that if he could buy her an apartment so she and Daniel could live there happily ever after. And of course her father would scream at her, do what you want, but don't expect me to pay for it, which of course angered Suzanne because she expected her father to do it, as all of her life that's what's been going on. And so seeing that there's nothing much she could do now, Suzanne in a defeated voice would tell her parents that fine, I won't see him anymore, But if you learned anything from this video, you'll know that that was a lie, and she was still dating Daniel. But still obsessed, she would tell herself she's going to do anything in her power to stay with Daniel. November 1st, 2002 was a day like any other day. It was an early morning and Suzane and her brother had just came back from sneaking out earlier in the night. And of course, since they sneaked out, there was no way they were going in through the front door, and so they would climb up and go through a window that they left open. But as soon as they walked into the house, they could see that there was a blood trail leading upstairs. So following this trail upstairs, it would lead them into their parents' bedroom. And as they got to the parents' bedroom, both of them would look at each other with a horrified face. And as they slowly opened the door, once the door was fully open, all the neighbors would have heard was a blood-curdling scream. And why were they screaming? Because they had just walked into their parents' deceased bodies. The police were called in, and quickly they found that some of the rooms in the house were completely in a tip, but some other places in the house was just completely fine. The rooms that were in a tip just looked like a robbery that went wrong. And when they got to the crime scene, aka the parents' bedroom, they saw both parents with savage scar marks all over them. And from what the police could tell, whoever did this used multiple weapons, because there was multiple scars all over the parents' bodies, from strangulation marks to knife marks, and whoever did this left the parents almost unrecognizable. The police would also find a suitcase that had been ripped open, and inside was money that had been taken. But as the detective came in and began to search around the property, they noticed that the alarm system that was in the house failed to go off, and if it had gone off, the guards around the residence would have been alerted and potentially saved the two. But they didn't go off, and in fact they found out that it had been disarmed, so whoever did this knew the code, which really grew suspicion on who could have done such a thing. Another weird thing was there was no sign of forced entry, there was no electronics stolen, and even though the main rooms such as the bedroom and the office room were in a complete tip, mostly the full house was pretty clean, so with nothing really left as evidence, the police would actually begin to ask the children some questions. First Andreas, who was actually just crying uncontrollably, accompanied with struggling to breathe. They would try to question him and try to get some answers out of him, but since he was crying so much, they couldn't. And so since they knew that they weren't getting anything out of him, they would go to Suzane, who for a girl that had just lost both parents seemed pretty calm. But either way, they would just continue to ask her some questions. And it was there that they found out about Suzane and her brother leaving the house last night. So naturally curious, they would ask them on what they did. And it would go Suzane and her brother left the house at around about 9 PM. And the main reason her brother was going out because he got invited to attend a party, and so Suzane, being the big sister, she would go drop him off. And so once dropped off, Suzane would leave and go do her other nightly activities, aka get in a motel with Daniel. The both would meet up back at around about 4 AM, where they would head home because their parents would always wake up bright and early, so they made sure that they're getting home nice and early so they won't get caught. And as you know, once they got home, they would discover their deceased parents. But this is where things would mess up for Suzane. You see, when finally her brother Andreas was fit enough and was able to talk, the police would question him, and the answers that he gave to the police contradicted Suzane's answers. For example, Suzane told the police that her and Daniel were a happy couple accepted by her parents. But of course, as you know, that was not the case. The police at first would not try to pry into anything more, as they wanted both siblings to attend their parents' funeral, which was on November 2nd. But after the funeral, many rumors came out about Suzane. For example, how still and uninterested she was during the funeral, and every time she would cry in the funeral, it just seemed forced. But another rumor that came out was just a couple of days after her parents' death, Suzane would host a pool party. But even though these were all rumors, the police were still suspicious with Suzane. But the one thing that really tipped the police over the edge was an anonymous tip that the police had received. And well, the person would tell the police that a man had just bought a motorbike, a very expensive one. But the weird part was, the person that paid for this motorbike paid the bike in full with $100 bills. But the main information about this whole tip was, the person that bought the motorbike was Daniel. And as we know, and the people close to Daniel, they knew that there was no way Daniel had the money for that. As well, they were just too poor to buy such an expensive motorbike without assistance from someone. And once they heard this, they would take Daniel's brother in for questioning. And although the journey towards the police station, Daniel's brother would act tough and would give out this unwavering confidence. But as soon as the police sat him down and would really begin to pressure Daniel's brother to speak, he would essentially just crack. Daniel's brother would admit to killing both of of Suzanne's parents. And the worst part was Daniel and Suzane would help him. And of course, when this confession came out, the couple would get arrested, and right away the two would give conflicting statements. Daniel would tell the police that the only reason that they did this was for the money, but to their surprise, when they asked Suzanne about it, Suzanne would say money had nothing to do with this. So the police, confused and with the fact that Suzanne would begin to cry and would just begin to blame Daniel and would make the whole situation into his fault, would actually be let out until the trial started, which by the way wasn't 4 years. And in that time she would go to many different local stations and would just basically act like a woman that was in the middle of a crossfire and that had been used. But there's a slight but though. Even though this would improve her image as an innocent woman, there was a certain footage that the camera picked up of Suzanne's lawyers pointing and showing on where to cry and where to act vulnerable. And when this came out, this would prove to the whole community that all those previous interviews were a big lie, and everything that she did and done was genuinely fake and just made her a disingenuous person. And of course the police would get wind of this behaviour and would rearrest Suzanne, and this time instead of feeling sorry for her, they would give her the same treatment as they did with Daniel. And after a couple hours she would crack and would reveal everything. On the late hours of November 1st was when this first started. Both Suzanne's parents were fast asleep quite early, since it was a Thursday and the parents had been working really hard. It was around about 9 PM when Suzanne and her brother would sneak out from the house. Her brother Andreas would think that this was some sort of innocent sneak out that they do all the time, but little did he know that this was much more worse than that. When Suzanne dropped her brother off at the party that he was attending to, she would go home, but not alone though. She would be accompanied by Daniel and his brother. Now the family's security guard did see Suzanne coming into the home, but they didn't see Daniel or his brother, so they let her through. Suzanne would park up, would tell the brothers to stay in the car, and then she would go through the front door, walk up straight upstairs to her parents' bedroom, where she would open the door and check if her parents were still asleep, and of course they were. And when she found out that they were still asleep, she would go and turn off the security alarm system. Once the system was off, she would tell Daniel and his brother to come inside, and as the brothers got into the house, the three would go into the living room where they would put on gloves and hoodies. But even though Suzanne didn't put a glove on, she would put a black hoodie on, as she intended to sit on an expensive couch as she watched Daniel and her brother go upstairs with iron crowbars. And a couple of seconds later, Suzanne could hear the brothers profusely beating her parents up with them same iron crowbars. But to the brothers' horror, no matter how many times they would bash the parents, they just wouldn't die. This is where the brothers would begin to panic, and one of the brothers would head into the bathroom and would get a towel and would wrap it around Suzanne's father, which managed to take his life. But somehow her mother Marisa was still alive. So in a last ditch effort, Daniel would look around the bedroom and saw that there was a plastic bag, and well, in the most soulless way possible, he would put the bag over her head and just strangle her to death. The three would begin to set the stage in the house so it looked like there had been a burglary. For example, they would spread office papers all over the office, and they would open many different drawers, but they did not forget to take as much money as possible. Once they were satisfied, they would head out, and in an attempt to create an alibi, they would drop off Daniel's younger brother at a fast food restaurant, and he would sit there where the cameras could pick him up, and while Daniel and Suzanne would go to a motel and spend the night there. And as you know, Suzanne would pick her brother up nice and early, and they would arrive back at home, and as they climbed through the window, Suzanne knew that both of her parents were deceased, and she would just pretend to be shocked again, even though she staged the full thing. And the sad part was her brother had no idea that her sister could do that, and as you know, Suzanne would do her best to blame it on Daniel, but of course Daniel was not having any of that and would fight back by saying that he was just listening to orders that she had given him. But either way, on July 2nd, 2006, all three criminals would be convicted of the murders of Suzanne's parents. Suzanne and Daniel would receive 40 years behind bars, and Daniel's brother would receive 38 years. And over the next couple of years, Suzanne would do her best to try and get out early by claiming that she had all these disorders and mixed personalities and other things, but every time she appealed, she would get denied. And the worst part was Suzanne's brother would never recover from the loss of his parents, and he would go on to commit burglary, and once he got caught, he would just tell the police that "I'm lost," which then the police would put him into a psychiatric ward, where till this day no one knows what's going on with him. So that'll be it for today's video of true crime stories, intrigues, or interest, and I highly suggest you subscribe to my YouTube channel, as that's all I do. And if you do subscribe, you can expect a brand new video every week. But with all that being said, thank you for watching, and yeah, goodbye.